And with that, we turn to the first item on our agenda, which is, of course, the activities of the Trade Union Congress. Now, I want you to take a good look at this shit and take time to take it all in. This is a fringe meeting to be held next week at the TUC, which, if you're not familiar with it, that is the Trade Union Congress. It is the umbrella body for trade unions in Britain. It holds its annual Congress every year where its leaders come together to make a lot of noise, then agree how best to not struggle against the capitalist class for the next year. Bear in mind, and we've got a couple of comrades, Jason and Terry, in the chat tonight from the Class Consciousness Project. The TUC leaders, including leaders of the CWU like Mr. Dave Ward and others, have just completed their annual sellout and have capitulated for zero reward for their members. And you've got a series of these sellouts. And what they're going to be discussing at the TUC Congress this year is how to pretend to look as if they've done something whilst getting everybody to vote for the Labour Party. Now, when you look at this particular thing that I've just put in front of you, you can see what their priorities actually are, which are, of course, the enthusiastic supporting of British imperialism, which, of course, aligns exactly with Keir Starmer's priorities. And what I'm about to talk to you about will show you that the TUC leaders and the Labour Party that they are attached to, bound hand and foot to, have not changed in over 120 years. They haven't changed since it was the days of Ramsay MacDonald and Snowden and the Webbs and people like that in the early days of the Trade Union Congress. They haven't changed from the very beginning, when it was a combination of the worst elements in the Labour aristocracy and the worst elements in the middle-class socialist milieu coming together to form a party that would call itself the Party of Labour, but would actually represent the uppermost layers of the working class and a good section of the English, well, British petty bourgeoisie, and represent all of the worst elements of both. This, of course, is a poster proclaiming at the top why we must side with Ukraine. And it's a fringe meeting to be held in Liverpool next week. Now, there's several things wrong with this, so it's probably going to take me a little bit of time to talk about it. But let's start with the fact that they purport to have two Ukrainian trade unionists speaking on their platform. Trade unions in Ukraine, even according to the United Nations pathetic NGO agency, the International Labour Organization, are heavily restricted and are in fact completely controlled by the state. And this was the case even before the beginning of the Russian special military operation. They were heavily restricted. Why were they heavily restricted? Well, the Maidan regime, which was brought in, lest we forget, in a coup organized by the intelligence services of Britain and the United States back in 2014. This was something that was brought in. I'll take this thing off the screen now. This was something that was brought in for the specific purpose of, well, two things. First of all, turning Ukraine into a weapon against Russia. Second of all, completely bringing Ukraine into the hemisphere, the sphere of Western imperialist influence. And that meant, of course, using the fascists as a battering ram to destroy the bargaining power of the Ukrainian working class. And the most militant section of the working class of the former Ukraine were, of course, those still left in heavy industry in what is referred to as the Donbass. This was one of the centers of the Bolshevik Revolution. It's one of the strongest centers still of resistance against the Ukrainian oligarchy. And it is this class war mixed in with, of course, a war regarding nationality that erupts in 2014, because it very much is the case that the Maidan regime was brought in with the first target in mind of destroying the Communist Party, the trade unions, and all working class resistance. And working class resistance was strongest in the Donbass. It was strongest there, and it was a very working class rebellion against this neo-colonial junta that was brought in with the active aid of US imperialism and British imperialism and all the rest of the wretched vassal states in Europe and Canada as well. And so the very establishment of that regime in Ukraine was the actions of the imperialists, and it was designed to smash completely any independent expression of organization of the Ukrainian working class, West or East. But in the East, it was the strongest, which is why the level of repression was the most severe in the East. It was said to be targeting pro-Russians, but in reality, it was starting off by targeting any strong working class organization, anybody who could be described as pro-Russian could be chucked in there as well. But that's where this starts. It starts with the need of the imperialists to destroy all working class resistance in Ukraine. And so we get this, which is basically bringing in speakers from state-controlled fake trade unions in Ukraine, which are completely dominated by the office of the president, Zelensky, which is itself completely dominated by US imperialism. And let's dissect the language here. These people are not siding with Ukraine. Gary Smith of the GMB Union is not siding with Ukraine. Last year, the GMB Union participated in the putting together of a motion to the TUC calling for a rearmament under the guise of reindustrialization of Britain. They called for the rebuilding of the British arms and military industries. This was a motion that was co-presented with the Prison Officers Association. And so the GMB, of course, are all in on British militarism. I mean, so for them, it's not about supporting Ukraine at all under any circumstances. It's about their narrow interests, a narrow sectarian interest, which is based upon the idea that, well, if arms production goes up, we might get a few jobs out of it. So the other side of this that I wanted to examine was, of course, talking about the language. Going back to that, they're not siding with Ukraine. They're siding with British imperialism. I mean, I've talked at length many times on these streams and in the previous podcast format about what was actually going on in Ukraine, not just for the last 10 years, but for the last 30 years, which is a rapacious oligarchy, asset stripping and deindustrializing the whole country, casting millions into poverty, causing mass migration out of the country, causing birth rates to collapse. These are the people that were the movers and the shakers of the coup the first coup in 2003 and the next coup in 2014 in order that they could make war upon the Ukrainian working class. And these are the people who are behind and who were behind the establishment of the Maidan regime, which is a viciously anti-working class regime, which is sold specifically even before the beginning of the special military operation on the basis that it was going to be exactly that, a regime that would destroy the ability of the Ukrainian working class to offer any resistance to the looting of the country. And loot it they indeed have. They've been looting it for decades. They've been selling off all the fertile land to multinationals based in the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and the USA. And they've been, of course, asset stripping and destroying all the productive industries that were left by the Soviet industrial legacy. This is a nation that, unfortunately, is run by the worst criminal parasites one could possibly imagine, other than those running Britain. So how are these trade unionists, these alleged trade unionists, siding with Ukraine exactly? When what they're doing is they're supporting this anti-working class neo-fascist junta that was brought in and immediately started making war upon the most militant sections of the Ukrainian working class. So they're not siding with Ukraine, if you look at it in the correct fashion, and they're not siding with Ukraine by calling for more arms to go to Ukraine. As we've covered many, many times, Ukraine has been reduced to the status of one giant outsourced army by British, US, French, German, Italian, and Spanish imperialism. the collective US bloc. That is what the Ukrainian state has been turned into. It's what they've turned the Ukrainian population into, a giant battering ram, so that these states, which have now become so weak, their connection with their own populations, with the working class, is so weak, they have no ability to call upon the loyalty of the working class to wage offensive wars anymore on a mass basis. These nations can't do a call-up. The British government can't do a call-up. Nobody would go. Only the blind and the mad and the desperate. And the US, even after the 9/11 incident, couldn't actually sustain a level of military recruitment that would be necessary to actually fulfill its wild imperial dreams. They'd have done far more damage in the world over the last 20 years if they'd been able to call upon the loyalty of the masses, but they can't call upon it. And so what do? They turn a nation in the form of Ukraine into a battering ram, which they're going to use as an outsourced military to attack the interests of the Russian Federation, to attack Russian-speaking populations, and they hope to use it as a battering ram to secure the destruction of the Russian government one way or another when you combine it with the sanctions regime. So these fading, decaying, decrepit powers, which can no longer mobilize a significant army, and can no longer go to war with anybody who's not far technologically inferior to them. They can bomb from 2 miles up in the sky and massacre on the ground with their superior technology. Well, these people have found a nation to turn into a charnel house. And that is what they have done to Ukraine. That is what they have done to the working class of Ukraine. And to see these contemptible frauds sat in Liverpool, echoing and aping the language of international solidarity, they are not siding with Ukraine. They are siding with British imperialism. British imperialism in particular, but along with US imperialism, has one plan for Ukraine, and it is to keep the war going as long as they possibly can, to throw more Ukrainian men and women onto the Russian bayonets and into the path of the Russian artillery, to sacrifice hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, to keep the war going and going and going and going, with no hope of actually winning, of course, no hope of doing anything, no hope of actually doing anything other than keeping it going for the purposes of hoping against hope. That is the imperialists' hope that somehow the sanctions will kick in and Putin's regime will crumble. And if they can't get that, they're just going to keep it going and keep getting all of these people slaughtered until they hope that when the Russians do eventually win, it'll cost the Russians a hell of a lot of blood and a hell of a lot of treasure. And so at least when this defeat finally comes, they're able to say, well, just like Mitt Romney, that contemptible scumbag, and the best representative of the Mormon religion, did the other day, where he said, we're killing Russians at a very low cost. And that is what the likes of John McDonnell, Gary Smith of the GMB, Simon Weller of ASLEF, John Maloney, who I've actually met, he's the Assistant General Secretary of my former union, PCS, are all supporting. And the most sad and tragic case of all, the General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers, a man called Chris Kitchen. Now, I'm not sure how many actual members the NUM has these days after the mining industry in Britain got destroyed, but all of these names should be remembered as, to use Lenin's old phrase, nothing more than social imperialists, social chauvinists, socialist in word, chauvinist in deed. And the thing that they are supporting behind this ridiculous and contemptible and cowardly mask that they are wearing, they are not supporting Ukraine. They are supporting British and US imperialism. And that, by the way, is what John McDonnell has done for his entire career, as have the rest of them in the Labour left, because they're all on board with this. They're all on board with keeping this war going because fundamentally they're all on board with British imperialism. And to return to the point upon which I started, to echo Cromwell's point, these are a pack of mercenary wretches. The Labour left, the trade union leaders, the wider British left, who are either outright rabid social imperialists and social chauvinists, or milk and water pacifists who wring their hands and equally denounce Russian imperialism because they're terrified that they might actually face the wrath of the British ruling class, if they did something actually effective to oppose a war, which they've never done in their entire meaningless, miserable, contemptible, empty political careers. This is the state of the leadership of British trade unionism. It's exactly the same as it was over 120 years ago. It's exactly the same as it was in the days of the Second International. It doesn't represent the British working class. It doesn't represent any working class anywhere in the world. It represents only the most reactionary layer of the upper end of the working class. It represents the self-interest of the trade union bureaucracy. It represents the cowardice of the British left. It represents the most foul expressions of British imperialism on the political level, and it is making its presence felt in Liverpool next week, trying to put a leftist mask on the support for the violently anti-worker Ukrainian neo-fascist regime. And putting a pleasant face on it is the job that John McDonnell has been doing for British imperialism for his entire career. This man is one of the people that I despise the most, because he's worse than any Tory. John McDonnell is worse than the ghost of Margaret Thatcher, the ghost of Enoch Powell, the actual sitting Tory government. John McDonnell's worse than all of them, as are the rest of them. Richard Burgon, Nadia Whittome, Zara Sultana, all of that crowd of this wretched gang in the so-called socialist, so-called campaign, so-called group, all of them are worse than any Tory. Because what they will do is what John McDonnell will do, and he is the master at this, is he'll, drop a Lenin quote, drop a Marx quote, talk about solidarity, wave the red flag, talk about socialism. But what is he actually doing? When he had the opportunity to actually exercise some power, what did he do? Well, he brought back and tried to redeem Tony Blair. Where he capitulated and grovelled before the City of London and declared that he wanted to be good for business. He doubled down on witch hunting his own supporters, people who'd gone out there and campaigned for him, by indulging in the fake anti-Semitism scandal. He capitulated on Brexit and alienated the Labour Party even further from huge numbers of the working class. And why did he capitulate on Brexit? Because is it because that he was under pressure from the hysterical middle-class leftists who think that Nigel Farage is the second coming of Oswald Mosley? Well, it's partly that, but he mainly capitulated on Brexit and embraced the second referendum because it's what the British ruling class wanted. That's why him and Corbyn capitulated, not because some whining Guardian readers who got hysterical and went on a second referendum march. No, John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn were responding to what they always respond to, which is the whip hand of the British ruling class. That's what they were bending over backwards to please and pacify and appeal to. It was the City of London. It was British imperialism that they were desperate to serve, not the Guardian readers, not the petty bourgeois left. They're just a convenient excuse, something to hide behind. It was British imperialism that John McDonnell was serving then. It's British imperialism that John McDonnell is serving now, as do the rest of them. And as for the trade union leaders, I mean, these people have never been particularly inspiring figures, to say the absolute least of them. But these days, they've degenerated to the point where they're openly supporting a regime that murders trade unionists almost on a daily basis. It murders working class people in the east of what was Ukraine, now the new Russian regions, by bombing them and terrorizing them and unleashing fascist gangs against them. That's what John McDonnell is supporting. And this has made me almost vomit in protest. It's one of the most contemptible things that I've ever seen. I shouldn't be surprised by it, because after being active in the trade union movement for about 11 years, not as long a time as my comrade Jason and Terry, but I shouldn't have been surprised that it's got this bad, but it has. And if you pay attention to the last name on that list, I'm certain Mr. John Maloney, he is a member of an organisation that's called the Alliance for Workers' Liberty. Now, who are the Alliance for Workers' Liberty? Other than, of course, being popularly associated with and enthusiastic supporters of Mr. Paul Mason, who the state asset Paul Mason, as revealed by Kit Clarenberg and the Grey Zone. The Alliance for Workers' Liberty is one of the most disgusting Trotskyite organizations in the world, and that's up against a lot of stiff competition. They are the direct lineal descendants of the likes of Max Shachtman, who, again, I will remind you, started off as a supposed revolutionary and ended up supporting the US in the Vietnam War. They are visceral anti-communists. They are rabid imperialists. They are rabid chauvinists for the American-led imperialist system. And they dress this up, they mask it with this faux militancy that they like to practice in the trade union movement. They'll always be the ones demanding more rank and file action, more action to defy the bureaucracy, wildcat strikes now, all the buzzwords you could possibly imagine. And they're very appealing to younger and pissed off members in some of these trade unions. But then you go beyond that, and what you find is that these are people who are rabid supporters of the Labour Party, rabid supporters of British imperialism, and of course they support every dirty war and every dirty deed that British imperialism has ever engaged in. The whole big time sort of rank and file, bang the table, we demand militancy now act that they engage in the trade unions is just that. It is an act. There's nothing real to it. Because if your political solution is voting for the Labour Party and supporting British imperialism, then you do not support the working class in this country or anywhere. You are a supporter of imperialism just as much as any Tory. And that is why I will maintain that John McDonnell is a worse enemy of the British working class than any Tory. A Tory, at least, most of the time, you can see clearly for what he is and who he is and what class he stands for. These so-called socialists in the so-called socialist, so-called campaign, so-called group, and the trade union leaders who mask it, who wave red flags on a May Day, who sing the red flag at the Labour Party conference, who stamp their feet and harumph every now and again about Keir Starmer, these people are the hidden enemies of the working class. But I will end this particular section on a note of positivity. The working class, beyond the trade union bureaucracy and labour aristocracy, the working class in Britain has actually worked these people out. And I would argue they worked them out quite a long time ago, because the level of enthusiasm for the Labour Party has been draining away since the 1950s. The Labour Party reached the high point of membership in the middle 1950s. Then when it became really obvious to most workers that it was never going to actually change anything, its support just drained away. And it's always got in just by not being the Tories. When the Tories become too divided, too weak, too corrupt, and too useless, and threaten the credibility of the system by being so, the ruling class just swaps them out and promotes the Labour Party, and they get in on the back of not being the Tories. And that's all that the working class is prepared to do for them, occasionally vote for them because they're not the Tories. Most workers, though, either don't know who John McDonnell is or would probably fucking hate him. And they're exactly right to do so. These people, those people on that list, and a lot of them at the TUC next week, they are the bitterest, most dire enemies of the British working class, because they are the ones who will throw a million barriers to get in our way of actually building meaningful struggle. The Tories will do it just by the use of the policeman's truncheon and the iron fist of the state and the hysterical lies of the media propaganda machine, all clear enemies that you can identify. But, and this is where we get to the tragic role of the National Union of Mine Workers. The National Union of Mine Workers, for those of you who are watching overseas and aren't perhaps familiar with it, waged the last great heroic struggle of the immediate post-war era, which is the miners' strike of 84 to 85. A strike that was powered by the level of strong, genuine rank-and-file organisation in the mines and in the mining communities, and that's what kept them out for a year. Now, why did they lose? Now, I could do an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours on this, and in fact, a while ago we did do a 4-program special on the miners' strike. You can still find it on the Patreon. But to shorthand it, they lost because they were betrayed. They lost because they were betrayed by the hierarchy of the trade union movement and the Labour Party. That's why they lost, because the trade union leaders moved heaven and earth in active collaboration with the Tory government to make sure that no solidarity action took root, to make sure that the miners weren't supported in any real way other than as isolated bits of industrial action. If something had happened similar to what had happened in the early 1970s, such as like basically whole industries coming out on strike, then the Thatcher government would have fractured, been destroyed, and had to have resigned or tried to call a new election, or it would have seriously undermined their credibility to the point where the sustainability of their actions would have been called into question. But the trade union leaders worked night and day to make sure that the NUM remained isolated. And Arthur Scargill, of course, the former leader of the NUM, knew that very well, even though he remained sort of trapped within the trade union bureaucracy himself. He knew that they were working night and day to make sure his union and his workers, the men he'd grown up and spent his life fighting for and representing, remained isolated and could be easily destroyed by the state. That's who betrayed the miners' strike in 1984. It was the people supposedly on the miners' own side. But in reality, they were desperate to sell out every single struggle that took place in the early 1980s that could have built real resistance to the Tories. So the ISTC steel strike of, I believe, 1980 to 81. There was, I believe, a strike, and Jason can correct me if I'm wrong here, involving the train drivers on British Rail in the early 1980s. There was an attempt to get a general strike going from the South Wales region of the TUC in the early 1980s. There were several other big struggles that could have taken off. And it was the trade union bureaucracy and the Labour Party that actively sought to suppress those struggles and make sure that they lost. Then these fuckers have the nerve to turn up and babble on about how bad Thatcherism was. These are the people who delivered it to us. Now, at the risk of sounding like I've been reading too much war theory, there is a great line from the piece of Chinese wisdom, shall we say, from Sun Tzu, which is that a defeated army first defeats itself. It's the disorder in your own side which guarantees your defeat. The actions of the enemy can take advantage of your division and the confusion and the chaos in your own ranks, but it is your own disorder that damns you every time. And that's exactly what happens with these big struggles of the British working class. It's these people. It's the social imperialists, the social chauvinists, the fake socialists, the likes of John McDonnell, the likes of the trade union leaders on that poster, Gary Smith, Simon Weller, John Maloney, and a myriad of others who sell out every struggle whilst waving a red flag and singing the Internationale. Those are more dangerous enemies than Margaret Thatcher, John Major, or any Conservative Party politician, because those are the enemies who can pull the rug out from under you at any moment and have done. And you get it right up to the moment with the likes of big-time left-winger, big-time socialist, Mr. Dave Ward, sure to become Lord Ward of who the fuck knows where very soon, I'm sure, for his services to the British capitalist class. But that's who's on that fucking poster. That's who'll be at that wretched meeting next week, which will talk about solidarity. It'll wear the skin of previous heroic movements, but it is a meeting on behalf of British imperialism, held by enthusiastic supporters of British imperialism, held by the people who have sold out every working class struggle they've ever got their hands on, and will do so again at a moment's notice. This is who runs the trade union movement in this country, and they are our enemies and will remain so. I will now pause for comments from the floor. Okay, so hello to Benedict Black. Just read that miners from Donbass had given support to the NUM back in 84 to 85. Yeah, that's a really good point. Of course, there's still a very strong mining industry in Donbass. And as Benedict points out in the comments, they were some of the biggest supporters internationally of the NUM back in the 80s. Now the NUM General Secretary, this miserable piece of crap, is speaking at a rally to demand that the miners of Donbass get bombed more. That's what British imperialism does to its defeated enemies. It converts them into a front group for itself, which is what my comrade Jyoti pointed out on Twitter with regard to the NUM. Hello to Andrew. Hello to Burke. Hello to Lavitz. Irish Partisan says the Labour Party condemned James Connolly and the Irish Citizen Army. Yeah, and they would do all over again. The Labour Party has always been a very bitter enemy of the Irish liberation struggle and remains so to this day. Irish Partisan said, comrades should go to this event and debate these wretched fascist apologisers. It's a good idea. I'm tempted to go myself if I can get the time away. Hello to my comrade Naylor. Hello to Roddy. Zuleika, it's in Liverpool, as Benedict replies. Roddy says, no surprises, any of them, especially McDonnell. Hello to HM. Yes, Zuleika, John McDonnell did wave the little red book around, but I very much doubt he'd ever read it or understood it if he did. Roddy says, having lived and worked in his constituency, you're spot on about McDonnell. As big a fraud as you could ever come across, careerist chancer. Yeah. Met that guy on numerous occasions, and there was always something a bit slimy about him, but he really revealed himself when he got a chance in power. Jason says, I've been a trade union activist for almost 30 years and would have never believed that they could plumb the depths they've done in the last few years. Yep, absolutely the case. AWL, this is from Naylor, recently came out in defense of the man, Alan Baker, pretending to be a woman, who told trans activists to punch women who didn't believe them in the face. Yeah, this is a lunatic who threatened to assault people at a public rally, and then following an outcry, the Met Police finally arrested him. And the AWL supports like these violent nutcases who declare themselves to be women, then threaten women with violence. That's the kind of people the AWL are, and always have been. So it's no surprise that they support fascists in Ukraine and elsewhere. They also support Islamic fundamentalists, by the way, in Syria and Libya. In fact, they support just about anybody that British imperialism is on the side of. Ain't that funny? The NUM has apparently 82 members. Thanks for that one, Jason. That's a depressing end. Hello to Tusker. Good evening to you. And Jason confirms, yes, the ASLEF went on strike in 82 and what became known as the flexible rostering strike. Now their top bureaucrats are vocal supporters of British imperialism. It's a grim fucking thing. So I wanted to start with that because I think it sums up all of the issues with British trade unionism. And I think if you are watching from the United States, you could probably go to the AFL-CIA site and find exactly the same thing. They'll be doing exactly the same shit. They've probably got AOC there careening around, tap dancing and talking about solidarity. And she's probably going to, I don't know, dance the Charleston with a member of the Azov battalion or something. So that's the first thing on the menu, and that particularly foul event is coming up next week. Something to not look forward to there. So, moving on to other matters. Having started dramatically, we will now go to the next part of our agenda, which is to look at the discussions around the question of what next for the US imperialist bloc, which I guess flows naturally from talking about some of their most enthusiastic supporters. And there's been a number of commentaries about this recently with the expansion of BRICS, with the talk of the setting up of a BRICS alternative financial system, with the idea that there's going to be BRICS trading currency, and the end of the role of the US dollar as the international currency of choice, as the international reserve currency, which of course, as the economist Michael Hudson rightly points out, once that's done, then the gigantic amount of dollars in the world will increasingly become worthless. And that, of course, calls into question the ability of the US government to even finance itself, and which, of course, will create a giant crisis internally. Now, there's some people who are advocates of the multipolarist position who argue that, well, if the US just gets better political leadership, then it can change itself and find itself a place in this new multipolar world, and then we can have a new and ordered system based on mutual respect of sovereignty and win-win cooperation. And I say, in response to those people, that's a really nice story. Try telling it to your children before bedtime. It'll put them to sleep because it's fucking boring. The problem with that point of view is that it is stunningly naive with regard to the imperialist system, and also what the basis for not just the US, but this entire bloc that it is built around. And again, I will return to the words of Stalin, who said after World War II that the US had put the British and the French on rations. And essentially, US imperialism, having carved out bits of the old territories of the old markets of Britain and France and Italy and the other colonial powers for itself, was obliged to save the former colonial powers from destruction by bankrolling partially their social democratic reforms after World War II and helping them to preserve their imperial spheres of influence. France might have lost and Britain might have lost their control over their directly occupied colonies, but of course, as we've covered when it comes to the situation in West Africa, the ability of the French and the British to maintain neo-colonial control over these places very much was something that was retained, with, of course, the active assistance of US imperialism as the guarantor and the overlord of this system. And this system, of course, isn't without its contradictions. No, nothing within capitalism is without contradictions. So there are, of course, contradictions between the French and the Americans, sometimes between the British and the Americans, as has been outlined in several academic studies on the matter, including the book The City, which is a book which is written by a former city banker turned Marxist, who analyzes the development of the city of London, particularly after World War II, and its new place within the globalized financial system. So I would recommend the book by this guy called Tony Norfield, The City, which outlines this. It's a very interesting and informative book from an insider turned Marxist. And why I mention that as an example because he does chronicle in there some of the conflicts between the British and the US that have gone on over the years. It's not all plain sailing in one direction between these two powers. There are tensions between them. There are antagonisms between them. But ultimately, whether it's disputes between Britain and America, France and America, Britain and France, the Netherlands and Germany, ultimately these ruling classes all come together and solidify so far because ultimately they know that their interests are guaranteed in the final analysis by US military power. That is why they agreed to the effective US occupation of Europe after World War II. And that's why they continue to enthusiastically support NATO to this day, because what it is it's not in reality an army of occupation that guards against a Russian invasion any more than it was guarding against a Soviet invasion 50 years ago. That was never on the cards, and most of the senior people in the military and intelligence and political apparatus of the US and the Western European powers all knew that. What NATO is and was is an army of occupation which has its guns pointed at the domestic working class. That's who NATO's guns are principally aimed at. Yes, they've now got themselves involved in a proxy war using the poor Ukrainians as a battering ram against the Russians, but it remains the case that US imperialism keeps the occupation of Europe going because it is a way of guaranteeing the governments of Europe continue to do what they're told. Not that they'd have much problem with them anyway, but also that any radical movement from the working class can be crushed, if necessary, by a military power backed up by the United States. That's what it was all about. It was about having the military forces in place, operating undercover, often through the Gladio system. Go back to our interview with Kit Clarenberg recently about that. But that's what it's there for. those occupations are there to keep those American guns ultimately trained on the working class of the occupied nation, on behalf of the weakened ruling classes of those nations who needed that army of foreign occupation in order to back up their own interests. So this US imperialist bloc is something which, although there are periodic rows between them, they all stick together because the US has guaranteed the interests of these ruling classes for almost 80 years, and it will continue to do so. So what happens when the decline of US imperialism really starts to bite? And at the moment, there's a lot of people going around screaming about, well, when are the Germans going to break away? When are the French going to break away? When are the Italians going to break away? Well, the answer is, under the current circumstances and under the current ruling classes, never. It's not going to happen. They're not going to break away. They're not going to suddenly rediscover some sort of independent spirit, because these are ruling classes, whether they're French, German, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, British, or Irish, that have been completely subordinated for US imperialism for almost a century. They're not breaking away. Their interests are completely bound up with the interests of US imperialism, and US imperialism is ultimately their guarantor, their backer, their master, and they're not going to break away from it. Not when they've had their profits guaranteed by the military backup of the US and their security of their class, not our security, their security, guaranteed by US imperialism since World War II. They're not breaking away. They're going down with the ship. If the US ship goes down, the German ruling class and the French ruling class will go right down along with it. That's why they're all clinging together, and they'll all hang together or hang separately. And I say that with the divine hope that we might hang them all together at some point. But I'm joking, just for the YouTube censor there. But the fact is that they will all stick together on this point. They will all stick together when it comes to the war in Ukraine. One of the most fatal and stupid mistakes that the revisionists in the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet Russian leaders made was in imagining that by doing deals with Europe, they could somehow winkle them away from the United States. It was never going to happen. No matter how much oil and gas the Russians provided and how much money was coming out of Russia and into the real estate market of Paris or London or even New York itself, they were never going to be able to replace the sheer weight of US imperialism. And to give you an indication of where this weight comes from, I'll return, of course, to the statistics provided by the US's own Bureau of Economic Affairs. The US moves $1 trillion a year in capital out of the US into the European Union area and Britain. Now, a lot of that goes through various different financial centers. It goes through London, it goes through Paris, it goes through Berlin. And a lot of it also gets invested in various projects across Europe. And of course, they extract their profits back again. Also, the Germans have the US as their #1 export market. Not China, not anywhere else. It's US imperialism itself, the US homeland, which is the #1 German export market. It's a huge export market for the French as well. And it's a huge partner in terms of the heavily financialized British ruling class. So for all of those reasons, whenever you get some sort of vague opposition emanating from the ruling class politicians of Germany or France or Italy, it's pretty quickly crushed, or they're pretty quickly subordinated. That is why, of course, Meloni in Italy, having moaned about the French and talked about Italian sovereignty, gets into office, is probably shown the sheer number of Gladio operatives that exist in Italy, and immediately starts enthusiastically supporting the war in Ukraine. I jest slightly, but these so-called populist characters like the AfD in Germany, they're not going to defy US imperialism either. US imperialism will allow them to posture and gesture over immigrants, Islam, multiculturalism, homosexuals, lesbians, the trans stuff, all of that kind of stuff. They will allow them to make gestures over that whilst waving their finger at them. But they're not going to allow the AfD to undermine NATO or the EU, which is another crucial piece of the US empire, just as Marine Le Pen has spent the last decade slowly coming round to a position that is acceptable to the French ruling class and is acceptable to US imperialism. Yes, she's made some critical noises about French policy over Ukraine, but if she were to become French president tomorrow, the French policy would not change. Because, again, the French ruling class are not going to defy American imperialism. What remains of their imperialist influence within certainly Africa and South America is essentially existing on the sufferance of US imperialism, with the ultimate backstopping of US imperialism. They're not going to break away. So any hope that people had that somehow they're going to readjust themselves, these imperialist powers, these G7 nations, these ruling classes that have been kept on life support by US imperialism since 1945, they're not going anywhere. They're not going to trade it in for a new relationship with the Chinese, even if the Chinese are the new rising power. All these nations, even though, of course, you can say that, well, all the GDP they have is all fake because a lot of it's financialized. A lot of this capital, of course, gives them a very real power because it gives them the power to invest or divest anywhere in the world. I mean, China has come an awful long way and achieved an awful lot, which should be acknowledged and respected. But they're still, in terms of actual amount of GDP produced and ability to move capital around, still not up to the same level as the imperialist powers are. Yes, these are all powers who have hollowed themselves out, which are becoming more and more corroded and more weak, but they're all collectively still a dangerous bunch who are prepared to engage in all manner of destructive activities rather than actually accept a new balance of forces in the world. Because again, to re-emphasize the point, when US imperialism goes down, they all go down with it. And they all know that. And so they did want to trade with the Chinese for a while while they thought they could hyper-exploit Chinese labor. But of course, as soon as US imperialism snapped its fingers, Meloni pulls out the Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, she was always going to do that. Any other Italian government would have done the same thing. It's a miracle that they ever went in the first place. And so we here are in a position where the entire US imperialist bloc is going to go down together. They're not going to suddenly split and renegotiate themselves new deals with other areas of the world. They're not just going to accept that there's some new multipolar reality that they need to adjust themselves to. Because if they can't extract super profits by moving their capital around to the African nations, the South American nations, nations in Southeast Asia, anywhere else in the world, if they can't extract the maximum profits from doing that, then their whole business model goes down the pan and they go down with it. Then they're not going to adjust. They can't adjust to this any more than the old feudal lords could adjust to the coming of capitalism. They can't. So they are left with two choices. And this is particularly true in the case of the American ruling class. They can either continually try and start wars to try and destroy the rising powers. In this case, at the moment, it's Russia. They're trying to do it with China. They are, of course, constrained, though, by the fact that they don't have the necessary authority that will be required for them to call upon vast numbers of the American masses to serve in the military anymore. The defeat inflicted upon them by the Vietnamese is still bearing a very heavy legacy that affects their ability to act to this day. And they are still, of course, without an adequate industrial base that would allow them to actually wage this war. So they're going to try all manner of other things, though. They're going to try and steamroller out the way any government which opposes them in South America. They're going to try and reassert themselves in nations like Haiti, in the Caribbean. They're going to also have to go to war against the American worker, because only by driving down the living standards of the American worker are they going to be able to actually afford to reindustrialize. And this is where things are going. There's going to be no adjustment from the political classes in America or Britain or anywhere else, but let's focus now on the United States. There's going to be no adjustment there. The enormous amount of capital that the US financial system moves around the world gives, of course, the Wall Street guys, the financiers, the financial capitalists, the driver's seat in terms of being the dominant faction in the ruling class. The smaller capitalists cry foul and say this isn't fair, protest a lot, but we've seen from the Trump presidency, which was backed by some of the smaller capitalists, what these people are capable of, and it's generally not a lot, because they are nothing next to the enormous power of the financial capitalist organizations. And the fact is that as we go towards this period of decline of the influence of US imperialism, they're likely to try and do one of two things, one after the other. One is implement first a Bonapartist and then a outright fascist regime in the United States and elsewhere in order to viciously drive down the living standards of the working class, and also, once they've done that, try and then rally some new sense of national unity to make war, if not on some of their powerful rivals, then on some of the weaker countries around them, which is why you get talk from the Republican debate stage about the need to invade Mexico. You also get that, by the way, from the Democratic Party. That's clearly a priority for some section of the US ruling class, to assert themselves again, to secure their dominance over what they see as their hemisphere. And so this is where it is going. We are not heading towards a soft landing here. To think that we are shows a massive naivety. It's you're telling a fairy story worthy of Karl Kautsky, if that's what you're saying to people. None of these ruling classes in America or Europe are going to accept the fall of their bloc. This is not, as I said last night, the later period of the Soviet Union, when you have a foul and reactionary and weak comprador class emerge somehow victorious after 30 plus years of counter-revolution. You have now a ruling class in the United States that's been in place for over 200 years. It's been the dominant power in the world for around about 100 years, since the fading of the imperialist powers in Europe after World War One. And you have in the British ruling class a foul collection of utter parasitic reactionaries who have been at the top of British society for 250, 300 years, whose system has accumulated to them vast amounts of wealth, which is now almost solely dependent upon, as Lenin once put it, the clipping of coupons and the exploitation of other areas of the world. They're not going to give any of that up voluntarily. They're going to fight and attack the working class at home and attempt more acts of imperialism overseas before this is done. And so rather than telling the working class at home fairy tales about how we can, vote for some pseudo-populist guy who's going to stop the American empire, no. You need to be preparing the way for what will be a vicious class war to come, which is why, of course, I started this program by saying that the social chauvinist left and the trade union bureaucracy, who lie to people all the time about what is possible and what isn't in our own countries and get in the way of working class struggle, why they're a deadly enemy, just as anybody who tries to spin bullshit to the working class about a return to Keynesianism, social peace, welfare capitalism, some kind of settlement with the ruling class again, none of that is on the cards. What we are faced with is going to be ultimately a fight to the finish as to, is it going to be the case that the capitalist classes, the imperialists in the United States and the rest of the countries in its bloc, in trying to preserve their own position, essentially damn all these nations to ultimate decay and then ultimate destruction? Or is it going to be the case that the actions of the organized working class led by communist parties are going to redeem these nations? Those are the two choices. There isn't another one, however much people in academia might wish that there were. Those are the choices on offer before us. I have made mine, which is that I will do whatever I can to build for the latter. The trade union leaders and the bureaucracy have made theirs. They will cling to the bloated corpse of British imperialism till it explodes and sinks under the water. So, I will now pause for further comments from the floor. My comrade Terry says, these modern union leaders are only concerned with an ermine robe. Very true, vermin in ermine. Zuleika says, Zuleika gives the correct title of the book, which is The City London and the Global Power of Finance by Tony Norfield. Look that one up and have a read of it if you can. Peter says, Dr. Bob Gill holds that UK economic and foreign policy is formulated and set in the City of London with a permanent Treasury servants rubber stamping it. No one gets to vote on that. Democracy rocks. Well, as I've said many times before, there's no such thing as democracy. There is bourgeois democracy, and then in the future there can be proletarian democracy, but there's no such thing just as democracy. What we've got is a bourgeois democracy, which means it's a democracy for the bourgeoisie, where they've been obliged to concede the formality of a vote to the working class, but they've managed to secure themselves a system whereby that makes no difference to them whatsoever. It's very ingeniously designed. So, we have now been going for roughly 1 hour, and as we've got a mega show coming up tomorrow, I am going to leave it there for tonight. I hope you've gained something out of this, even if you've just gained an awareness of the great speech from 1653 by Oliver Cromwell. Tomorrow we will be running from 3 till 6 at the very least, a 3-hour Q&A show, because there's a lot of good questions to get through that have come in on the Patreon and through other sources as well. So I hope you can join me for that. But until 3 o'clock tomorrow, I will bid you adieu and say always beware of John McDonnell.